9 years after my fiancé walked out on me the night before our wedding, he stood in the middle of a crowded military ballroom, looked me up and down and said, "You're still just a paperwork clerk." Then he laughed. Not a nervous laugh. Not an awkward laugh. The same smug laugh I remembered from years ago. And for one split second, standing there beneath crystal chandeliers in Arlington, Virginia, I felt 35 years old again. The abandoned bride. The woman nobody wanted. The fool everyone felt sorry for. The military ball was being held at a hotel just outside Washington, D.C. The ballroom looked exactly like you'd expect. Dress uniforms, medals, polished shoes, white tablecloths, a military band playing softly near the stage. People were drinking wine, taking photos, and catching up with old friends. I had been looking forward to the evening. Then I saw Derek Collins, my ex-fiancé, the man who had disappeared less than 12 hours before our wedding. The man who left with his boss's daughter. The man who somehow still believed he was the smartest person in every room. I hadn't seen him in years. At first I thought about turning around. Then I realized something. Why should I? I hadn't done anything wrong. So I stayed exactly where I was. I picked up my glass of sparkling water and kept talking with a retired colonel I knew from a personnel readiness project. Then Derek spotted me. I watched recognition spread across his face. A slow smile followed. That smile immediately made me uneasy. Some people grow older. Some people grow wiser. Derek had mostly grown more confident. He excused himself from the group he was standing with and walked straight toward me. I could almost feel trouble coming. "Rachel Bennett." I turned. "Derek." He looked me over. Not in a friendly way. More like he was taking inventory, seeing whether life had punished me enough. "Wow," he said, "it's really you." I smiled politely. "It is." "You look good." "Thank you." There was a brief pause. Then his eyes drifted toward my name badge. I watched the exact moment he saw my rank. A small smirk appeared. "Still in personnel?" There it was. The first jab. I took a sip of water. "I am." He chuckled. "So you're still doing paperwork?" A few nearby people glanced in our direction. Most pretended not to listen. Military people are experts at pretending not to listen. I should know. I've spent most of my adult life around them. I shrugged. Somebody has to keep the army running. That earned a couple quiet laughs from people nearby. Derek didn't like that. I could tell. So he pushed harder. "You always were good at forms." There was something about the way he said it. Not joking. Not teasing. Dismissing. Reducing. Like everything I'd done in the last decade could be summarized by a filing cabinet. Then came the line. The one I'd remember for a long time. He leaned slightly closer. "Leaving you was the smartest decision I ever made." The conversation around us seemed to slow. Not stop. Just slow. Like everyone within 10 feet suddenly became very interested in their drinks. I felt heat rise into my face. For a second I didn't trust myself to answer. Not because I was hurt. Because I was angry. 9 years. 9 years of rebuilding. 9 years of work. 9 years of becoming someone I was proud of. And somehow this man still thought he knew me. Before I could respond, a memory hit me so hard it felt physical. Suddenly I wasn't standing in a ballroom. I was back in Fayetteville. Back in that apartment. Back on the worst night of my life. 9 years earlier. The wedding was scheduled for Saturday morning. Friday night should have been exciting. Friends were in town. Family members were arriving. My dress was hanging in the guest room. Everything was ready. Or so I thought. Around 7 that evening I realized Derek wasn't answering his phone. At first I wasn't worried. Then an hour passed. Then 2. Then 3. My stomach started tightening. I called again. Voicemail. Again. Voicemail. Again. Nothing. I sent text after text. "Where are you? Call me. Is everything okay?" No answer. Around midnight, my father arrived at my apartment. He was trying to act calm. He wasn't succeeding. "You heard from him?" I shook my head. My dad looked away. That scared me more than anything, because my father was a retired Army sergeant, the calmest man I'd ever known, and he looked worried. At 1:17 in the morning, my phone buzzed. A text message. Just one. I still remember every word. "Rachel, I'm sorry. I can't do this. Vanessa and I are leaving together. Please don't contact me." That's it. No phone call. No explanation. No apology worth mentioning. Just a text. A relationship that lasted years ended in fewer than 20 words. I remember staring at the screen, reading it again, and again, and again. My brain refused to process it. I actually thought there had to be some mistake. Then Vanessa's social media account disappeared. Derek's account disappeared. Everything disappeared. And I knew. My fiancé was gone. The next morning was worse. Guests arrived. Family members showed up. People whispered. People stared. Some people cried. Others avoided eye contact entirely. Nobody knew what to say. I didn't know what to say either. At one point, my father suffered a panic-related medical episode. Seeing him on a hospital bed because of what Derek had done broke something inside me. The wedding never happened. The reception never happened. The future I thought I was building vanished overnight. Late that evening, after everyone finally left me alone, I checked into a cheap motel outside town. I couldn't bear going home. I sat on the edge of the bed wearing sweatpants and an old army t-shirt. Mascara stains covered my face. The room smelled like stale air and industrial cleaner. A vending machine down the hallway provided dinner. Crackers. A soda. That was it. I sat there eating saltines and wondering how my life had gone so wrong. Around midnight, I looked into the bathroom mirror. I barely recognized myself, and for the first time a terrible thought crossed my mind. Maybe Derek left because he was right. Maybe I wasn't enough. Maybe I wasn't interesting enough. Pretty enough. Important enough. Maybe I really was just the woman behind the desk. The woman nobody noticed. Back in the ballroom 9 years later, I looked at Derek standing in front of me. For a moment, I remembered exactly how that broken woman had felt. Then I remembered something else. She didn't stay broken. And Derek had absolutely no idea what happened next. The morning after Derek left, I wanted to disappear. Instead, I reported back to work the following Monday. Not because I was strong. I wasn't. I showed up because I didn't know what else to do. My desk was still there. My computer still needed a password. Soldiers still had pay issues, missing records, transfer questions, leave forms, family emergency paperwork, and problems that couldn't wait for my broken heart to heal. So I worked. At first, that was all I could manage. One task, one folder, one phone call, one soldier standing in front of my desk saying, "Ma'am, can you help me?" And I would say, "Sure, sit down." That became my life for a while. Sit down. Let me look. We'll fix it. I didn't know how to fix myself, but I could fix other people's paperwork. And strangely enough, that kept me alive. People love to joke about administrative work like it was nothing. Forms, signatures, spreadsheets. But in the Army, paperwork isn't just paperwork. It decides whether a soldier gets promoted, whether a family receives housing allowance, whether a widow gets benefits after losing her husband, whether someone gets sent home in time to say goodbye to a dying parent. I learned that early, and I took it personally. Maybe too personally. I stayed late until the cleaning crew knew me by name. I ate dinner out of vending machines more times than I should admit. I kept a bottle of cheap hand lotion in my drawer because government office air will dry your skin out like sandpaper. A young captain once walked by my desk and said, "Ask the admin lady, she knows where the forms are." He didn't mean it kindly. I smiled anyway. "Sure, sir. Which one of your unsigned forms did you lose this time?" The sergeant standing next to him nearly choked on his coffee. That was the first time I laughed after Derek left. A real laugh. Small but real. Over the next few years, I stopped trying to prove anything to Derek in my head. At least that's what I told myself. The truth was messier. Some mornings I still imagined him hearing my name somewhere and regretting what he'd done. Some nights I hated myself for caring. But I kept going. I applied for the warrant officer program and got rejected the first time. The review board said I had potential but not enough demonstrated leadership experience. I remember sitting in my car outside the building gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles hurt. For 10 minutes I let myself cry. Then I wiped my face, went back inside, and asked what I needed to improve. The warrant officer who reviewed my packet looked surprised. Most people got defensive. I brought a notebook. He said, "You really want this?" I said, "Yes, Chief, I do." He nodded. "Then stop waiting for someone to notice you. Make your work impossible to ignore." So I did. I volunteered for everything nobody else wanted. Broken systems, ugly audits, messed up records, emergency readiness reviews that made grown adults suddenly remember dentist appointments. I learned logistics because personnel and logistics are cousins that argue at Thanksgiving but still need each other. I took night classes. I finished my master's degree while deployed writing papers at 2 a.m. with bad coffee and a laptop that sounded like it was preparing for takeoff. There was a helicopter accident one winter that took several soldiers from different units. I won't give details. Some things don't belong in a story. But I will say this. 47 families had benefits travel records and casualty support issues that had to be handled correctly and quickly. Not beautifully. Not emotionally. Correctly. Because grief is already cruel enough without paperwork making it worse. I was part of the team that untangled that mess. I called offices in 3 time zones. I tracked missing documents. I sat with spouses who were too exhausted to understand what they were signing. One woman, maybe 60 years old, grabbed my hand and said, "Honey, I don't know what any of this means." I said, "That's okay, I do, and I'm not leaving until you do too." That moment changed me. Not loudly. Not all at once. But after that, I stopped seeing my job as the place I landed after being left. It became the place where I mattered. A year later, I was selected. Chief Warrant Officer track. People who used to call me paperwork girl suddenly started calling me ma'am, with a little more caution. That made me laugh more than it should have. Rank changes how people talk to you. It doesn't change what you're made of. By the time I met Ethan Walker, I had already rebuilt most of my life. That's important. People like Derek would later assume Ethan saved me. He didn't. He met me standing on my own 2 feet, tired as all get out, carrying 2 binders, a laptop bag, and a cup of coffee I had already reheated 3 times. It was during a personnel and logistics reform project at Fort Belvoir. Ethan was a colonel then. Quiet. Focused. The kind of man who listened before speaking, which is rarer than it ought to be. I had written a long report about readiness failures caused by outdated tracking procedures. Most officers skimmed the first page and asked for the summary. Ethan read all of it. All 42 pages, including the appendices. The next morning I found an email from him. Chief Bennett. This is the clearest analysis I've seen on this issue. Your recommendations are practical, not political. I'd like you in the working group meeting Thursday. I read it 3 times. Then I looked around my little office like someone might jump out and say it was a joke. It wasn't. At the meeting, Ethan asked me questions. Real questions. Not the kind men ask when they've already made up their minds. Afterward, he walked beside me down the hall and said, "You don't waste words." I said, "I work in personnel, sir. Wasted words become bad policy." He smiled. Fair point. That was the beginning. Not romance. Not at first. Just respect. And respect after what I'd been through felt almost dangerous. Months passed before he asked me to get coffee. Not dinner. Coffee. At a place near base with sticky tables, burnt muffins, and a cashier who called everyone sweetheart. I almost said no. I had the word ready. Number. Safe. Simple. Then Ethan said, "No pressure, I just enjoy talking to you." That was such a plain sentence. No performance. No charm offensive. Just honesty. And somehow that scared me more than flirting ever could. I went home that night and stood in my kitchen staring at my phone. Part of me wanted to stay locked up forever. Another part of me was tired of letting Derek live rent-free in rooms of my heart he no longer deserved. So I texted Ethan back. "Coffee sounds nice." Then I put the phone down like it might explode. That was how my second life began. Not with a grand rescue. Not with a man fixing what another man broke. Just with me choosing not to let betrayal have the final word. Standing in that ballroom, I should have walked away after Derek made his little speech. A smarter person probably would have. Instead, I stayed. Partly because I refused to let him chase me off. Partly because Ethan was supposed to arrive soon. And partly because I was curious. 9 years is a long time. Long enough to build a career. Long enough to heal. Long enough to become strangers. But not quite long enough to erase curiosity. So I stayed. The military band transitioned into a slower song while waiters moved between tables carrying trays of drinks and appetizers. Around me, conversations picked back up. The moment with Derek seemed over, at least on the surface. Inside, I could still feel it. Not the pain. The irritation. Like finding a pebble in your shoe after a long walk. I excused myself and headed toward the refreshment area. The hotel staff had set up coffee stations along one wall, and after years in the army, coffee remained my solution to nearly everything. As I poured a cup, a familiar voice spoke behind me. "Chief Bennett." I turned. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell. We'd worked together years earlier during a personnel modernization project. "Sarah," she hugged me. "Good to see you." "You too." We chatted for a few minutes. Family. Assignments. Retirement rumors. The usual military small talk. Then Sarah glanced across the room. Toward Derek. Her expression changed slightly. "You know, Collins," I laughed softly. "You could say that?" Her eyebrows rose. "Oh." That single word told me she understood there was a story. Military communities are surprisingly small. especially among officers and senior leaders. Stories travel, not always accurately, but they travel. I wasn't interested in revisiting ancient history, so I changed the subject. Unfortunately, Sarah wasn't finished. You know he's having a rough year. That caught my attention. A rough year. She nodded. Promotion board. I sipped my coffee. What about it? She lowered her voice. Didn't go well? Now I was interested despite myself. Not because I wanted him to fail. At least that's what I told myself. Sarah continued. He's been up for promotion more than once. I said nothing. She gave a slight shrug. Leadership concerns. That surprised me. Derek always knew how to impress people. He dressed well, spoke well, networked constantly. He could charm almost anyone for 15 minutes. The problem was the 16th minute. That's when people started seeing who he really was. Apparently, promotion boards had noticed. Sarah checked her watch. I should get back to my table. Before leaving, she paused. By the way, congratulations. For what? She smiled. Your award. I blinked. What award? You don't know. No. Sarah laughed. Oh, that's right. You never pay attention to those emails. Then she walked away before I could ask another question. I stood there confused. What award? Nobody had mentioned an award. Before I could think about it, further movement across the ballroom caught my eye. Derek. He had stepped outside onto a side terrace. A moment later, I noticed something unusual. He was arguing with someone on the phone. Even through the glass doors, I could tell. His shoulders were tense. His face was red. One hand cut through the air as he spoke. At first, I looked away. Then curiosity won. Not my finest moment. I moved closer to the terrace entrance. Not enough to eavesdrop intentionally. Just enough that I couldn't help overhearing fragments. I'm at the event. Pause. No Vanessa. Longer pause. His jaw tightened. I said I'll deal with it when I get home. Another pause. Then silence. A very uncomfortable silence. Finally, he said something that surprised me. I'm trying, okay? Trying. I couldn't remember Derek ever saying those words. Not sincerely. The call ended abruptly. He stood there staring into the darkness beyond the hotel grounds. For a brief moment, he looked exhausted. Older. Not physically. Emotionally. Then the expression vanished. The mask returned. And he walked back inside. I returned to my coffee before he noticed me. A few minutes later, I joined a table of people I knew from various assignments over the years. The conversation bounced around as military conversations often do. Bad weather, budget issues, retirement plans, someone's fishing boat, someone else's grandchildren. Eventually, the topic drifted toward leadership. One retired command sergeant major chuckled. You know who's lucky to still be around. Several people looked up. Who? Collins. I nearly spilled my coffee. The sergeant major continued. Guy had talent, but he never figured out how to develop people. A colonel nodded. I've heard similar things. Another officer added, smart guy. But every story about him starts with him taking credit and ends with someone else doing the work. The table laughed. Not cruelly, just knowingly. I sat quietly, listening, learning. For years I'd imagined Derek living some perfect life. The life he'd chosen instead of me. The life he'd considered better. The reality sounded considerably less impressive. Then came something I wasn't expecting. A retired brigade commander took a sip of coffee and said, Funny thing is, years ago, Collins used to talk about an ex-fiancé. My stomach tightened. The commander looked around the table. Said she was some admin specialist. Nobody knew where this story was going. I did. He told people she wasn't leadership material. The words landed harder than they should have. Not because I believed them. Because I remembered believing them once. Back in that motel room. Back when everything hurt. The commander continued. Said she'd never really go anywhere. Several people shook their heads. One laughed. Guess he got that one wrong. The table moved on. The conversation changed. But I couldn't. For a moment I stared into my coffee. I wasn't angry. Not exactly. Just disappointed. Because after all these years I finally understood something. Derek hadn't left because I lacked value. He left because he couldn't recognize value unless it came with status attached. That realization felt strangely freeing. Then came another surprise. A female major I'd never met sat beside me. You know, Collins, apparently everyone wanted to discuss Derek tonight. Yes. She leaned closer. He's terrified. I laughed. Of what? The upcoming promotion review. That part I already knew. She shook her head. No, not just the review. What then? The major lowered her voice. The final recommendation passes through General Walker's command structure. I froze. Not visibly. Years of military professionalism prevented that. But internally, I froze. Because suddenly several pieces clicked into place. Derek was desperately trying to move forward. Desperately trying to become a lieutenant colonel. And somewhere in that process sat a man he desperately wanted to impress. A man he had never met personally. A man who happened to be my husband. The irony was almost ridiculous. I actually laughed. The major looked confused. What's funny? Nothing. I shook my head. Just life. Across the ballroom, Derek was talking animatedly with another group of officers. Completely unaware. Still convinced he understood the room. Still convinced he understood me. And in less than 30 minutes, everything was about to change. I don't know exactly when people started looking toward the entrance. One moment the ballroom was filled with 100 separate conversations. The next attention shifted. Not dramatically. Not like in the movies where music stops and everyone freezes. It was subtler than that. A ripple. A change in energy. Heads turning. Whispers moving from table to table. People standing a little straighter. I looked toward the doors and smiled, because I already knew who had arrived. Across the room, someone quietly said, "That's Walker." Another voice answered, "General Walker just got here." A retired colonel near me immediately adjusted his jacket. An officer who had been telling a long story suddenly forgot the ending. Even the hotel staff seemed aware that someone important had entered. Major General Ethan Walker had that effect on people. Not because he demanded attention, because he'd earned respect. There is a difference. I've met powerful people who needed everyone to know how important they were. Ethan was the opposite. The more authority he gained, the less interested he became in showing it. That's one of the reasons I fell in love with him. The ballroom doors opened wider. And there he was. Tall, calm, dress uniform perfectly pressed, silver hair beginning to appear at the temples. The same steady expression I had seen 1,000 times before. For a brief moment he stood near the entrance greeting a few senior officers. Then his eyes began scanning the room, looking for me. I watched it happen. The instant he found me, everything else disappeared. The room, the crowd, the conversations. Gone, at least for him. Because that's what Ethan does. When he's talking to you, he makes you feel like you're the only person in the world. Across the ballroom, I saw him smile. A real smile. Not the public one, the private one. Then he started walking, straight toward me. At first, Derek didn't notice. He was busy talking to 2 lieutenant colonels and a civilian contractor. Still performing. Still networking. Still trying to be the smartest person in the conversation. A few seconds later, he noticed movement. His eyes followed Ethan's path. I watched confusion appear on his face. Then curiosity. Then something else. Something closer to concern. Because Ethan wasn't stopping to join any of the groups surrounding him. He wasn't lingering near the senior leadership tables. He wasn't heading toward the stage. He was walking directly across the ballroom. Toward me. One step at a time. The closer he got, the quieter Derek became. The lieutenant colonel he was talking to kept speaking. Derek wasn't listening anymore. Neither was I. I was too busy watching my husband. A strange warmth settled over me. Not because Ethan was a general. Not because of rank. Because after all these years, seeing him still felt like coming home. When he finally reached me, his expression softened. "There you are." 3 simple words. The kind most people would never remember. I always do. Because Ethan somehow made ordinary words feel important. I smiled. "Traffic. Pentagon meeting ran long." "Of course it did." He laughed. Then he looked at me more carefully. Noticing something. Maybe the tension in my shoulders. Maybe the forced smile I'd been wearing for the last hour. Maybe both. "You okay?" That question almost broke me. Not because I was upset. Because it was genuine. After years together, he could still tell when something wasn't quite right. I nodded. "I am now." His hand rested gently against my back. A small gesture. Comforting. Protective without being possessive. The kind of touch that says I'm here. Nearby conversations resumed. But something had changed. People were watching. Not openly, just enough to notice. Because they were trying to figure out why General Walker had crossed an entire ballroom for one warrant officer. Then realization began spreading. One person whispered something. Then another. Then another. Across the room, Derek's face lost color. Not much. Just enough. The kind of reaction that happens when someone suddenly realizes they've misunderstood a situation. Badly. Ethan followed my gaze. His eyes landed on Derek. "Who's that?" I laughed softly. You really don't recognize him? He studied Derek for another second. Then his eyebrows lifted. Oh, that was all. Just one word. But after 9 years of marriage, I knew exactly what it meant. Oh, that's him. The guy. The story. The reason I spent years rebuilding my confidence. The man Ethan had heard about but never met. To his credit, Ethan never said anything negative about Derek. Not once. Even when we were dating. Even after we got married. He simply listened whenever I needed to talk. Then helped me focus on the future. That's one reason our marriage worked. He never tried to rescue me. He respected me too much for that. A few senior officers approached. Handshakes followed. Introductions. Small talk. The normal social rituals of military events. What surprised me was what happened next. The conversation quickly shifted away from Ethan. Toward me. A brigadier general from another command smiled. Chief Walker, congratulations on the Readiness Award. I blinked. There was that award again. What award? The general laughed. You really didn't read the email? Apparently not. A colonel joined in. You received recognition for the Personnel Modernization Initiative. Another added, long overdue if you ask me. I felt my face getting warm. Recognition has always made me uncomfortable. Praise is nice, but attention, not so much. While they talked, I noticed Derek standing about 20 feet away, watching, listening, trying to understand. The look on his face was almost fascinating, because for the first time since I'd seen him that evening, he wasn't confident. He wasn't smug. He wasn't amused. He looked uncertain, like someone trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. Then came the moment that changed everything. One of the colonels smiled at Ethan and said, Sir, your wife might be the only reason half our personnel systems still function. The group laughed. Ethan didn't miss a beat. I've been saying that for years. More laughter, including mine. And that's when I finally saw it. The realization in Derek's eyes, not that I was married. Not even that I was married to a general. The realization that people respected me. Not because of Ethan. Because of me. For 9 years, Derek had assumed I was the supporting character in someone else's story. Standing there in that ballroom, he was beginning to understand how wrong he'd been. And the night was only getting started. If you'd asked me 10 years ago what revenge looked like, I probably would have given you a very different answer. Back then, revenge meant winning. Getting ahead. Making the other person regret everything. Making sure they saw exactly what they'd lost. Standing in that ballroom, I discovered something surprising. Real revenge doesn't usually arrive with fireworks. Sometimes it arrives carrying a glass of iced tea and wearing a name tag. The next 30 minutes became the most uncomfortable half hour of Derek Collins's life. And nobody planned it. That's what made it beautiful. The ballroom had settled into a comfortable rhythm. People were eating dinner. The military band had taken a break. Conversations drifted from work to retirement plans, grandchildren fishing trips, and everything else people discuss when they're finally old enough to stop pretending work is their entire personality. Ethan had been pulled into a conversation with several senior leaders near the stage. I was standing with a group of officers and civilian personnel specialists I'd worked with over the years. That's when Derek approached again. I saw him coming. This time his smile looked different. Less confident. More calculated. Like someone trying to recover from a mistake. He stopped beside our group. Rachel, I turned. Derek. His eyes flicked briefly toward Ethan before returning to me. I had no idea you were married. Most people don't. That part was true. I had never built my identity around Ethan's position. I didn't introduce myself as a general's wife. I had my own career. My own reputation. My own accomplishments. Derek laughed awkwardly. Well, good for you. I nodded politely. Thank you. A silence followed. The kind people usually escape from. Derek didn't. Instead, he pushed forward. You look happy. I am. Another pause. Then he smiled. You always deserved a good life. I nearly laughed. 9 years earlier, he hadn't seemed particularly concerned about that. Still, I wasn't interested in arguing. That's kind of you to say. Several people nearby exchanged glances, not because of anything I said, because they could hear the history hanging in the air. Derek seemed determined to keep talking. I was actually telling someone earlier how impressive it is that you've done so well. That one almost made me choke on my water. Telling someone earlier. The same man who had called me a paperwork clerk less than an hour ago. Interesting revision of history. I simply smiled. Military life teaches you patience. Sometimes silence is more effective than confrontation. Apparently uncomfortable with my lack of reaction, Derek shifted gears. His eyes moved toward Ethan again. Then came the sentence that destroyed him. "Well," he said with a laugh, "I guess Rachel married well." The moment the words left his mouth, I knew he had made a mistake. Not because of what he intended, because of what he accidentally revealed. To Derek, success was still about proximity to power, still about who you knew, still about attaching yourself to the right people. The irony was almost painful. A colonel standing beside me set down his drink, slowly, deliberately. Then he smiled. "No, Major Collins." The conversation around us quieted. The colonel's voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. "General Walker married very well." Silence. For half a second, nobody moved. Then a few people laughed. Not mockingly. Not cruelly. The kind of laughter that comes from hearing an undeniable truth. Derek's smile disappeared. Completely. I looked away before he could see me trying not to laugh. Unfortunately for him, the conversation wasn't finished. A retired brigadier general standing nearby nodded toward me. "Chief Walker saved my command from a readiness disaster 6 years ago." I blinked. "Sir, that's a little dramatic." "No," he said, "it's accurate." Several people chuckled. The general continued. "We were preparing for deployment and discovered personnel records were a complete mess." He pointed toward me. Everyone else brought excuses. She brought solutions. A woman from Army Human Resources Command immediately joined in. "That's nothing," I groaned. "Here we go." She laughed. 3-day system failure. Remember that? Unfortunately, I did. Very clearly. It wasn't that bad. It absolutely was. The woman shook her head. Our personnel network crashed during a major transition. She looked at the group. Most people went home. Rachel stayed for almost 3 days helping rebuild records before deployment deadlines. I felt myself turning red. Praise has always been uncomfortable. Public praise is worse. Derek stood frozen, listening, watching, trying to reconcile these stories with the version of me he had carried around in his head for nearly a decade. Then someone else spoke, a retired military spouse. I hadn't seen her in years. She smiled warmly. "My husband passed away during active duty." The room grew quieter. She looked at me. "You probably don't even remember this." I knew exactly where this was going, and I wished she would stop. She didn't. I was overwhelmed. Benefits, paperwork, insurance, everything. Her eyes softened. "Rachel sat with me for nearly 4 hours. I looked down. The woman continued. She explained every form. A brief pause. Then she called 2 weeks later just to make sure I was okay. Nobody spoke, because there wasn't anything to say." The woman smiled. "I've never forgotten that." The silence that followed felt very different from the silence after Derek's insult. This one felt warm, human, earned. I glanced toward Ethan. He was watching quietly from across the room. Not interfering, not rescuing, just observing, the same way he always did, trusting me to handle my own battles. Finally, Derek cleared his throat. "I didn't realize." Those 3 words sounded strangely small. For years I had imagined some dramatic confrontation, a speech, a showdown, a moment where I unloaded every ounce of pain he caused. Standing there, I realized none of that was necessary, because the truth was already sitting between us, plain as daylight. I looked directly at him, for the first time all evening. 9 years ago, I said calmly, you thought my value depended on who I knew. Nobody interrupted. Nobody moved. I continued. You never bothered to find out who I actually was. That was it. No yelling, no insults, no dramatic exit, just the truth. And somehow that hit harder than any angry speech ever could. For a moment, Derek looked like he wanted to respond, then thought better of it. Because there wasn't a response, not an honest one. The conversation drifted elsewhere. People returned to their dinners. The evening continued. But something had changed. Not in Derek, in me. Because as I watched him walk away, I felt something unexpected. Nothing. No anger. No satisfaction. No triumph. Just nothing. And for the first time since he walked out of my life, that felt like freedom. The next morning I woke up before sunrise. Old military habit. No alarm needed. My eyes opened at 5:17 a.m., and for a few seconds I stared at the hotel ceiling trying to remember where I was. Then the previous evening came rushing back. The military ball. Derek. The conversations. The look on his face. The strange sense of closure I still couldn't quite explain. Beside me, Ethan was asleep. One arm stretched across the bed, completely relaxed. Which was impressive considering he'd spent half the previous day in meetings and the other half making small talk with hundreds of people. I slipped quietly out of bed. 10 minutes later, I was downstairs holding a cup of coffee and watching the sky lighten over Arlington. The city was beginning to wake up. A few commuters hurried along the sidewalks. Delivery trucks rolled through intersections. The world was moving forward, just like it always does. No matter what happened the day before. A few minutes later, Ethan joined me. He carried a coffee cup and looked annoyingly well-rested. "Morning." "Morning." He sat beside me. For a while, neither of us spoke. One thing I loved about Ethan was that he never felt the need to fill silence. Some people get uncomfortable if a conversation pauses. Ethan never did. Eventually, he glanced sideways. "So," I laughed. "So, how are you feeling?" I thought about the question. Really thought about it. Because the answer surprised me. "Peaceful," he nodded, as if he'd expected that answer. "Good." I'm happy the event is over." That made me laugh. General Walker afraid of social gatherings. Terrified. Nobody believes that. That's because nobody sees me afterward. I smiled. The truth was, Ethan genuinely preferred quiet mornings and small groups over formal events. One of the many reasons we'd always fit together so well. Around 7, we walked to a small diner a few blocks away. Nothing fancy. Red vinyl booths. Coffee that could remove paint. Waitresses who called everyone honey. Exactly the kind of place we both loved. We ordered pancakes, eggs, and bacon. The kind of breakfast doctors spend years telling people not to eat. While we waited for our food, Ethan looked at me over his coffee mug. "You know something?" "What?" "I don't think last night was about Derek. That caught me off guard." I leaned back. "What do you mean?" He considered his answer carefully. "The Derek situation ended years ago." I didn't immediately respond. Because part of me knew he was right. Ethan continued. "I think last night was about you finally realizing that." There it was. The thing I'd been feeling without being able to name. For years I thought closure would look dramatic. A confrontation. An apology. Some grand moment where the person who hurt me finally understood what they'd done. Life rarely works that way. Most wounds don't heal because someone apologizes. They heal because eventually you build enough life around them that they stop being the center of everything. I looked out the diner window. The morning sun was reflecting off nearby office buildings. People were walking dogs, heading to work, living ordinary lives, and suddenly I realized something. The best part of the previous night wasn't seeing Derek embarrassed. It wasn't hearing people praise me. It wasn't even watching him realize how wrong he'd been. The best part was understanding that none of it mattered anymore. His opinion no longer carried weight. Not because I'd defeated him, because I'd outgrown him. Our breakfast arrived. For several minutes we focused on more important subjects. Maple syrup, bacon, whether the coffee qualified as a controlled substance. The usual. After breakfast we returned to the hotel so Ethan could prepare for a meeting. I was packing when my phone buzzed. An email notification. I glanced down and froze. The sender's name read, Vanessa Collins. For a moment I considered deleting it unopened. That would have been understandable. Instead, curiosity won. Again. Apparently I hadn't learned my lesson. I opened the message. It wasn't long. Just a few paragraphs. "Rachel, I don't expect a response. Honestly, I don't deserve one. But after seeing you last night, there are things I need to say." The email continued. Vanessa explained that her daughter had recently experienced a painful breakup. A man had ended the relationship because he believed someone from a wealthier family would help his career. As I read those words, I had to stop. The irony was almost unbelievable. Vanessa wrote that watching her daughter struggle had forced her to confront something she'd spent years avoiding. What she and Derek had done. The damage they caused. The selfishness behind it. Then came the sentence that hit hardest. "I used to think status was everything. Now I know character matters more. I wish I'd learned that sooner." The email ended with a simple apology. No excuses. No requests. Just an apology. I sat quietly for a long time. Then I replied, not because she deserved forgiveness, because I deserved peace. My response was brief. "Vanessa, I hope your daughter finds her strength." I found mine. "Rachel." That was it. No lecture. No reopening old wounds. No revenge. Just closure. I hit send and put my phone away. A little later, Ethan walked back into the room. "Everything okay?" I smiled. "Yeah." He studied me for a second, then nodded. He understood. The drive home was peaceful. Traffic wasn't terrible. The radio played old country songs, the kind my father used to listen to when I was a kid. Somewhere outside Fredericksburg, I found myself thinking about the woman I had been 9 years earlier. The woman sitting alone in that motel room. mascara running down her face, convinced her future had ended. If I could speak to her now, I know exactly what I'd say. I'd tell her she survives. I'd tell her she becomes stronger than she can imagine. I'd tell her that losing one person doesn't mean losing herself. Most of all, I'd tell her this. The people who underestimate you do not get to define you. They never did. The greatest revenge isn't becoming someone superior. It isn't marrying someone more successful. It isn't watching another person fail. The greatest revenge is becoming a version of yourself that no longer needs their approval. That's what finally set me free. And if you've ever been betrayed, dismissed, or made to feel small, I hope you remember that your worth was never theirs to measure. Keep building your life one day at a time. The right people will see you for who you are.